Hello and welcome to another lecture of Econ 2301, Principles of Macroeconomics. This lecture will cover Chapter 6, which goes over unemployment and inflation. So, what exactly is unemployment and how is it defined and measured? Well, you have probably heard of the unemployment rate before, specifically over the last 5 years when politicians talk about it and how it has increased dramatically through the Great Recession. Well, most people think that the unemployment rate is just the amount of people that are not working. However, that's not true. It has to do with the labor force. And what is the labor force? The labor force is the total number of workers, both employed and the unemployed. You'll see that simple formula right there. This formula just is the people that want to work and are working, or the people that want to work and are not working. That's our labor force. This does not include people such as my wife, who is currently a stay-at-home mom, or my students who are college students that do not want to work while they're attending school, or my son, who is incapable of working. He is just a month and a half old, and right now, if he was my employee as his employer and all he did was spit up every day, I probably would fire him. I love him to death, but he would not be a good employee. We don't include him in the labor force. It just doesn't make sense. So the labor force is the amount of people who are employed plus the unemployed. They're looking for a job, right? Now, to calculate the unemployment rate, we take the unemployed, the amount of people you'll see right up here that are unemployed, and what we do is we take that divided by the labor force and times it by 100 to get our percentage. So for instance, let's say the unemployed amount of people was 10 million and the labor force was 100 million. We would divide that out and we'd get a rate of 10%. Now, you're asking maybe, well, why does it have to be the labor force? Well, what if it was the whole population? The whole United States. We included everybody, even the people who didn't want to work, and they should not be included because they're either incapable, like my son, or they're a stay-at-home mom, or retired, etc. Well, in that instance, let's see what happens if we leave it just like that on face value. So, what I have is 10 million divided by 100 times 100, which would be 10%. What if it was 10 divided by 250 million people? What I would get would actually be 4%. This is 10% over here on the right-hand side versus 4%. Well, 4% is actually pretty good unemployment. That rate is not only bearable or tolerable, it's not that bad at all. Right now we're at 6.7 and we're 5 years into the Great Recession. We would love to have 4%. Well, one way we could do it is falsifying the data and just including all of population. One thing to take note is that our labor force has been gradually decreasing, as well as our labor force participation rate, which we will look at on the next slide. So what is the labor force participation rate? Well, that is our labor force divided by the population 16 years and older. Now, the reason why it's 16 years and older is that in our country, we do have child labor laws, and we typically abide by them. Now, there are some instances, let's just say, for instance, you work out on a farm, and you're 14 and you get paid, or you work in the summer as a construction worker or something simple that doesn't require a lot of skill, and you are 15 and you're doing it as a hardship waiver, maybe to help your family out. Well, we would still include you, and let me show you why we're able to include you. Because you would, or why we don't necessarily need to include you, but if we did, it wouldn't make a difference. What it would be is 1 divided by 1, and so it would cancel out each other. So it's population 16 years and older. Now, one really interesting thing about the labor force participation rate is that it dramatically increased in the last 100 years. Mainly right after World War II and throughout the 60s. Now, why would it increase after World War II? Well, as men went off to war and fought, women who were unskilled before were allowed to join the workforce, gain these new skills, became employable, and went out and participated in the actual labor market. Interestingly, though, the last 5 to 10 years, we have seen a dramatic decrease of the labor force participation rate. A lot of people are choosing not to work. Now, they may be choosing not to work because of lack of finding a job or getting older. We are seeing the baby boomer generation retire. A lot of them are not included in the labor force participation rate because they're retired and they no longer want to work. This simple statistic kind of goes over how unemployment is measured and calculated. You will see that if we were to add all of the population, we would get a much different statistic than if we just compare it to the labor force, as far as this amount here being unemployed. This amount divided by this amount. This is just a simple graphic to kind of show you various countries throughout the world and their unemployment rates. These are all developed countries. What is very interesting, it doesn't necessarily matter if you're a centrally planned economy, more socialist versus a free market. During the Great Recession, everybody got hit badly. Now, I do want to point out, though, that some of the more free market economies have bounced back rather quickly, while you can look at Spain and Belgium and Sweden, and they're slowly decreasing their unemployment rate. Now, that's not necessarily just because of their market being centrally planned, but more their unemployment insurance incentives. In Spain specifically, your unemployment insurance is very close to 100% of your previous pay. Well, if that's your incentive, it probably lines up that you are going to want to stay unemployed because it just makes sense. If you're paying me almost 100% of what I was getting paid to do work, why would I want to go back to work? Alright, who are the unemployed? Well, the unemployed, one of the big factors of it, one of the components that is interesting to me, it's not necessarily the most dramatically significant factor, but it's just interesting to look at, is the component of unemployment attributed to seasonal factors or seasonal unemployment. Why it's interesting to look at is we know, just based on seasons, when we will see more unemployment. We're going to see a lot more in February versus December and November and October. The reason being is businesses are hiring more workers to cover the holiday season. Now, as those particular workers are no longer needed come January and February, they're going to start getting laid off. This is known as seasonal unemployment. Now, if we're going to look a little bit more broadly and get a more accurate view of the measurement of unemployment, this goes back to 2010, and I think the unemployment rate, which you can look at a previous slide, was 9.7%. Now, the only statistic that's in that 9.7 are these officially unemployed workers. These are people that are actively looking for work, but yet they're unable to find it. What is not included are discouraged workers, which these people right here, these discouraged workers, 1.2 million, are people who finally just gave up. They're no longer actively looking for work, so they can't be counted in the unemployment rate. They may have gotten tired, they may have applied for many jobs and just got turned down so many times that they're just fed up or they need a break. This was dramatically high. Now, if we also include the other categories here, we see that there are marginally attached workers. And marginally attached workers are workers who are barely attached to their current job. You probably will experience this sometime in your own career. This is where you are happy to keep working for a paycheck, but if a larger paycheck were to come around, you would leave that job and go pursue something else. You're barely attached. If you will recall a quote, those of you who are fans of The Office, Dwight, who is a character on The Office, once said he was very loyal to Dunder Mifflin. I think that's the name of the company. I just had a brain freeze there. I haven't seen The Office in quite a while. Anyways, Dwight, one of my favorite characters, he would say that he was very loyal to the company, very loyal to his boss, Michael Scott, and he was so loyal that as long as he got paid a certain amount, he would be completely loyal, but if someone else wanted him to be more loyal to them, all they had to do was up the ante. I think I totally butchered that quote, but oh well, that's beside the point. Anyways, going back to this. So we have this 1.32 million plus our 1.2. Well, we're already up over 17 million that we haven't even accounted for. We've only accounted for 14.87. Then we also have these workers right here that are employed part-time for economic reasons. Now, in February, we're going to see these huge numbers start to dwindle, and a lot of these people were only employed because of the holiday season. They racked up debt, maybe they needed an extra job, but they didn't want to work full-time, or the demand for that job, a lot of businesses are going to hire these workers just temporarily during the holiday season and then lay them off. You don't want to hire a full-time employee, especially now that some of the healthcare laws are in place. You have to offer insurance, etc., etc. Well, you'd rather just hire a part-time employee. So if we were to look at all these together, we're looking at 8 plus 1 plus 1 plus 14 plus another 2. We're looking at 26 million people. That is significant. We're almost doubling the amount of unemployed workers. So you can see that during 2010 it was much, much worse than both President Obama, Mitt Romney, or anybody else made it out to be. Alright, the categories of unemployment. Now there are 3 specific categories of unemployment. What we looked at previously was the measurements of unemployment. Now we're going to look at the 3 categories. The first is cyclical unemployment. This is unemployment that occurs during fluctuations in real GDP. In other words, as the economy, let's just say this is GDP, as it goes up and down and up and down, we see that the unemployment rate at the various levels, let's say right here, the unemployment rate is going to be low because the economy is going in an upward fashion. But as we go toward that trough there, we will see an increase in the unemployment rate. This is called pro-cyclical. In other words, or counter-cyclical, sorry, not pro-cyclical, counter-cyclical. In other words, it goes the opposite direction. So the cyclical unemployment, whenever the GDP increases, the unemployment rate goes down, and vice versa. Frictional unemployment. What is this? Well, this is unemployment that occurs naturally. It occurs with the normal workings of the economy, such as workers taking time to search for suitable jobs. A lot of you are going to apply for various jobs. When you do, you fill out an application, you submit a resume. Maybe it might take a week or 2. You'll get a call back, go in for an interview, possibly a second interview, and then you may be offered a job. Now that whole time, that employer is looking for the right person. But in between then, you are unemployed, or what we would call frictional unemployed. Now, let's say you get offered a job and you don't like that job and it doesn't fit you. Well, you'll decline that job Now, we wouldn't include you in the cyclical unemployment because you're not unemployed because the economy is bad or vice versa the good. It just means that you haven't found the right fit yet. Thirdly, and lastly, is structural unemployment. This is unemployment that occurs when there is a mismatch of skills and jobs. For instance, a lot of you will begin working during college, and you will find that a lot of places that you go to, you will be maybe smarter than and more capable than what your entry-level position is. For instance, I started off during college working at Subway as a sandwich artist. Now, I at the time was, I would say, 45 credit hours into a degree, so I was a sophomore, almost a junior, had working on a business degree. I believe I had more business classes than my manager. I felt like I was more capable than just being a sandwich maker, but because I didn't have the experience yet, I wasn't able to take upon a higher level job. Now, if I had worked there a little bit longer, I probably could have been promoted up quickly. But at that current time, there was just a mismatch versus my skills and the type of job that I was doing. So, what is the natural rate of unemployment? This is the level of unemployment at which there is no cyclical unemployment, and it only consists of frictional and structural. So you'll remember, if I go back and talk about cyclical, it was when the economy was going up and down and up and down. So what we would say the natural rate of unemployment, it might look something like this. The economy's slowly growing. And as it's growing, we will see that there's still the unemployment of structural and frictional, where I am mismatched by my job, I'm waiting for experience, etc., to get a better job. But at the same time, also, it takes time to find the right employee, vet various applications, things like that. What we would say is that if we are at the natural rate of unemployment, we are at full employment. This will never equal zero. Hint, that is going to be a test question. Full employment doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't actually mean at all that the unemployment rate is zero. It's impossible to be 0%. We're just going to always have some natural unemployment. Also, as the economy is growing and production is increasing, we see technology taking over various jobs and putting people in unemployment. For example, a long time ago, we saw telephone operators be put out of business because we use technology to call one another. We no longer call someone and they put us through to another person on a telephone line. Well, that wasn't because the economy was contracting or we were seeing some negative growth of some sort or layoffs of any kind that were directly related to a recession or the economy not doing well. What we were seeing then is technology and growth actually promoting production, and people are laid off. Unemployment insurance. These are payments that are given to those who are unemployed, who were working previously, but they have been laid off, and they are essentially transfer payments that what I like to call a double negative. And the reason why I call them double negatives, and it's a very harsh term, but why I like to call them that is the fact that these people are collecting insurance or income, but at the same time they're not paying taxes. And so this transfer payment essentially is a double negative on GDP. The good thing about it is that these people do contribute to GDP and consumption and things like that during the time of unemployment. However, because we don't have 100%, and we shouldn't have 100% unemployment insurance as far as your previous income, the reason being incentive, we don't want you to have an incentive just like in Spain to continually be unemployed. Because of that, we will see a decrease in overall consumption. All right, the real versus nominal principle and applying it to consumer price index and inflation. Essentially, if you'll recall, the real value of money is the purchasing power, whereas the nominal value is the face value. Well, we're more concerned about the real value of money. And one way we're able to determine the real value of money is by the consumer price index. This essentially gives us a confidence level of what price levels are comparative to previous years. It's a price index that measures the cost of a fixed basket of goods chosen to represent the consumption pattern of a typical consumer. For instance, we would take a poll of the average amount of groceries or necessities that a given consumer might purchase during a month. So let's say it was, and we'll look at a slide here in a second, but let's just say it was 20% on groceries, 30% on gas, durables, things like that, non-durables, luxury items, rent, mortgages. We'll look at all that. But if we added them all up together, and let's say today we were paying about $110 for that whole amount of all the goods, and previously we were paying $100, what we would see there, 110 divided by 100, we would get 1.1, and we times that by 100, we would come up with 110%. Essentially, what that means is the CPI is 110, or we are paying 110% of what we normally would pay. If we wanted to subtract that out, you can see easily by subtracting that out, we see the inflation rate is 10%. Essentially, the CPI is the current year of what you're going off of equals cost of the basket in the current year. So if we're going to talk about this year, like an example I just gave, if it was $110, we would divide that by the base year. So if we went back 20 years and it was $100, that's what we would go off of, and times that by 100. Now, the reason why we want to look at the CPI is the fact that it gives us a good average and comparison of how we're growing as an economy and how real prices are increasing. Now, you'll note that even though the real prices or CPI is increasing, our real income is also increasing. So we have more money to purchase things, even though it may be $110, $120 versus $100 10 years ago. If we're making more than that a month, our real income is actually increased. So what are some of the components of the Consumer Price Index? Well, this is going off of, I believe, 2010 as well. And it shows something really interesting to me. It shows that our rent is about 26%, and our food and beverages right here is 18%, which are relatively high, but these are the things that we're going to purchase. These are necessities. These are our food and board that we need every month. But the thing that's really interesting to me is our durable goods is 11%. Durable goods are things that are going to last, and we typically only buy them once, like a huge TV, a computer, things like that. And what's odd is that they're so high. They used to not be that high. But now, as we are becoming more and more rich or wealthy, we are able to purchase more of the durable goods, luxury type items. Alright, another thing that the CPI does for us is it helps us to determine our cost of living and cost of living adjustments. If you're in government, such as the city of Lubbock, every once in a while, usually I think every 2 years, maybe 3 years, they'll do a cost of living adjustment, and what they'll do is they'll figure out the CPI and see whether everybody needs a raise across the board. And in the example I just gave, if they hadn't gotten a raise in 20 years and it was 110% or 10% more than what it was, we would see a raise for the cost of living for all employees of 10%. The great thing about these is that it helps real wages keep up with natural inflation. So what is the inflation rate? This is the percentage rate of change in the price level. So in other words, we just took that example beforehand. If we took 110 minus 100, it would be a 10% increase. These are some historical inflation rates. One thing to note is that while gasoline has increased substantially by, let's say, it's not 30 times, but maybe 20 times, not sure, 18 cents. You go through these with a calculator. Look at this. Our homes have dramatically increased. 1940s, you could buy a home or a car, let's see, a home for $6,550, whereas in 2010 the average price was $350,000. Now you might be saying, well, we complain about gas and the price of milk going up all the time, and why don't we complain about our houses, our homes? That's because we only buy those once a year, or not once a year, once every 5 to 10 years, maybe even once a lifetime. We buy gasoline or milk once a week. We see that impacting our lives regularly. And this is just a graph showing the historical U.S. inflation rates and when they've increased, etc. So, well, if inflation is an increase of prices, then deflation would be a negative inflation or falling prices of goods and services. This is very bad because typically it happens when the economy is shrinking rapidly and suppliers need to make money, and so they rapidly lower prices. Anticipated inflation, this is inflation that is expected. This is what we think the economy will grow. Unanticipated inflation is inflation that's not expected. This is when things are going maybe bad or awry, or maybe even good, and we see a natural spike. Well, this can be good and bad. It can be really bad if we don't see real income increase at the same time, because that means that it costs more and we have less purchasing power. So what are menu costs? Menu costs are the costs associated with prices and printing new price lists. That's essentially what we had just a second ago, where we go through and we'll say milk costs $10 or $3. This costs, let's say, gasoline's $3, etc., etc., etc. We go through and we'll do a price list for everything, and we'll compare it to other menu costs from previous years. Shoe leather costs. This is the cost of inflation that arises from trying to reduce holdings of cash. So let's say you're a business and you're losing money quickly. What you would do is you would cut back on all of your costs, and you would probably increase your price levels. You would increase the goods you're selling. You would jack up those prices because you wanted to quickly hold cash. Lastly, hyperinflation. This is inflation that exceeds 50% in one given month. Hyperinflation rarely happens in a country. It typically only happens when we print money that's so rapidly in supply that the intrinsic value can't hold steady. We see this with countries like Zimbabwe and others that just printed money but didn't back it up. And with the United States, even though we aren't on the gold standard anymore, we do have to issue debt when we print money. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. As always, if you have any questions, please email me at jkemper at southplainscollege.edu. You can also follow me on Twitter at Mr. Kemper, MrKemper.